Okay, you caught me just as I was I was typing in chat. Thank you for that, Veritas. Hey, one of the things that you were talking about was that passage in John 8 that deals with Jesus claiming the name "I am ego eimi" of God. And when I cite that as because you're often asked the question, "Where does Jesus say I'm God?" Well, he says it right there in John 8:58. And a lot of times you'll get this, well, that's just a nuance, that's just your interpretation, that's just your, the translate, no, what is interesting is what happens in John 8:59. Nobody cares what my interpretation of it is. Nobody cares what your interpretation is. And nobody cares what, everybody else's interpretation is. Everybody cares about what those people on the ground at that time thought that Jesus meant. And when you get to John, the very next verse, what do? They say, "Okay, Jesus, we're sorry, we just didn't know." They say, "Okay, we're going to pick up stones, or we're going to stone you to death for blasphemy." So, when we start talking about, where does he say I'm God? It's right there. I got several people, got their hands raised here. I'm going to start with, we're going to go with the Imam, Kenny Bomer. I'm going to unmute your mic. And who is still hot here? Whose mic is still hot? Veritas there. Let me mute you, sir. Okay. Mr. Kenny, you are on the show. Where'd you wait?
I'm here. Assalamu alaikum.
You were down here. Now you're up here. I think you're doing this intentionally to me. All right, you're on. Go ahead.
Okay.
Mic is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to thank everyone who's contacted me privately, greeting me respectfully, and for telling me that they believe that Robert should have apologized to me personally, since I was the one he directed his insults at. I thank you for making those comments. And so, as we talk about this topic, we have to do some honest self-reflection, and so that's what my intention is here today, just to get us to think and ponder and reflect on some things, and to do some self-reflecting. And we have to ask ourselves, are we looking for the truth, or are we looking for comfort? And we have to realize that the truth isn't always comfortable. And so we're forcing ourselves, if we're going to be honest with ourselves as individuals, we're forcing ourselves to do a reality check. So as we begin, I want to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious and most merciful. I do bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I do bear witness that Muhammad is his final servant and the seal of all prophets. And it is not my intention by no means to insult anyone here. I'm not here to ridicule anyone. I'm not here to ridicule Christianity. I'm just here to engage in a conversation and to get people to ponder, think, and reflect. And as I begin, I want to mention that this is an ongoing issue within Christianity itself. This isn't a Muslim-Christian issue. This has been a contention since early Christianity, with Marcionites and the Erasmus and Stoic and the Stoics, and Docetism and Marcionism, and just on down the line. So in all those periods, and with all those different individuals, they came with different philosophies, and they were debating with one another about the status of Jesus, peace and blessing be upon him. So this is not a Muslim issue, and so this is not something that needs to be directed towards Muslims in this debate. And me being here as a Muslim, I'm not here to do anything other than to present some things for us to think about, inshallah, God willing. So in saying that, there's a gentleman by the name of Robert Cialdini, and he's described as the father of influence in his writings, The Principles of Persuasion. And in those writings, he says, and I quote, "There's a natural human tendency to dislike a person who brings us unpleasant information, even if that person did not cause the bad news. The simple association with it is enough to stimulate our dislike." Now, so I pray that people aren't looking at me during this conversation, what I'm going to present in this manner, just disliking me simply because I'm a Muslim. He also goes on to say in his writings, and I quote, it says, "When making a decision, it would be nice to think that people would consider all of the available information in order to guide their thinking, but the reality is very often different." So once again, it'd be nice if people would gather all of the information to guide their thinking, but the reality is very often different. And so we need to be honest with ourselves about this issue, on the topic of Jesus and where it stems from. And so there's what psychologists refer to as anchoring bias. And what anchoring bias is, it's a belief where a person is going to adhere to their original beliefs, the things that they was first presented with. And a good example would be if someone was going to purchase a new vehicle and they're looking for sale prices, they come across the sale. Instead of them going on to look for other possibilities and better sales, they stick with the original one that they came across. And so that's an anchoring bias. And it also rolls over into confirmation bias, where people are favoring their existing beliefs while discounting evidence of anything that contrasts to those beliefs. And this is the platform for what psychologists refer to as misinformation effect. And this is influenced by what people hear and what they hear, instead of having actual facts and figures or true information about an event. They're relying upon simply hearsay. And we see this as evident in the development of Christianity, because most of the scriptures were passed on, and all these different stories were passed down through word of mouth. And matter of fact, the bishops and the high priests are the ones that had the scriptures for themselves. They didn't allow the common people to have these scriptures. And so while they were debating with themselves about what the scriptures meant, the people under them were limited to just hearsay and just arguments, information being passed down verbally. So when we ask ourselves, and if people are honest with themselves about this question, why do Christians believe that Jesus is God? If you ask the majority of Christians this, and if you're honest and about the situation, you'd have to admit that most Christians are going to say, well, that's what we were taught. And the people that were taught this were taught by their parents and people that they love and respect, and people that they admire, and people that they want to believe are telling them the truth and sharing the truth with them. And so in asking that question, I believe wholeheartedly that each of you gentlemen that are listening right now, and people that are listening, if you're a Christian, and someone asks you this question, and you go from the very beginning, what originally made you believe that Jesus is God? Well, you were taught that. You didn't read that anywhere. Most likely you were just taught that. Okay, so as we proceed, I want to go to a story that Bart Ehrman has in his book. As a matter of fact, it's right here in my hand. I don't know if you can see it or not, but how Jesus became God. And he talks about a particular story where he's riding with his preacher after he's gone away to college. He's come back and he says, I'm going to pick it up with what I have highlighted here. He says, and he's talking to his preacher while they're riding in the car, and he says, I began to tell him the doubts that I was having about the Bible and about what I had formerly held to be sacrosanct. He said he was sympathetic, since he had always been a bit more liberal and a whole lot less doctrinaire rather. And he goes on to say his view was that we simply had to hold on to the basics. He told me to remember that Jesus had said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. And that's all that mattered. And then Bart Ehrman says that he asked his preacher, but what if Jesus never said that? And he said that the preacher was taken back and stunned, and good pastor that he was, tears started to well up in his eyes. He says, it hurt me to see, but what could I do? You can't believe something just because someone else desperately wants you to do so. But if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that we've been, I've been Muslim for nearly 32 years at this point, alhamdulillah. But initially, I was taught that Jesus was God from the time I was very, very young. And I would assume that that's the case with the vast majority of Christians today. And so what we do is we take, by tradition, once again, most people get caught up in the golden calf syndrome. I refer to it as the golden calf syndrome, where we want to go back to what we feel comfortable with, just like the Jews did while roaming in the desert for 40 years, but following the prophet Moses, alayhi salatu wasalam, peace be upon him. They wanted to go back to what made them comfortable. What made them comfortable was the original deities that they were taught to worship by the Egyptians that held them in captivity and in slavery. And so in this golden calf syndrome, there's many Christians today that they have the question in their mind, well, who is Jesus? Is he the Son of God, or is he God himself? Are we praying to Jesus right now, or are we praying to God? And if you ask this question and be honest with yourself in dealing with this, you know, you would have to admit that you've had this very question in your mind at some point along the way. Maybe you've gotten to a point where you've convinced yourself, you know, in one particular way of thinking. But the fact is that some point along the way, most assuredly, it has to be that Christians have questioned themselves internally about who it is that Jesus is. Okay, and so, you know, it goes back to the golden calf syndrome. So I want to present just a series of just simple, basic questions that are just simple yes/no questions, and we can get into for every I assure you, for every scripture that's quoted that is implying that Jesus is supposed to be God, and ambiguous verses that implying that Jesus is God in eisegesis, where people are reading into the text something that isn't there. I can present 2 or 3 others that are going to contradict that, and we can get into that in a moment. But I want to just address these basic questions that we should ponder and reflect on, and these are simple questions, just the basic logic. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we were born on an island and we were never told about Jesus or any other religion for that matter, would we believe that Jesus was God? Obviously we wouldn't, because we wouldn't have heard his name. But would we have an inclination within ourselves that our God and our Creator is one? Would we have an inclination, if something happened to us and we were alone on that island, would we have an inclination within ourselves to cry out to someone or something to help us? Absolutely, and that's what we call in Islam, in the Arabic language, it's fitra. We have this natural inclination. And so in this natural inclination, is that natural inclination that God is one? Well, yes, it is. And so the next question would be, if something is asserted repeatedly, does that make it true? If something is told over and over and over again, does that make it true? And the answer is simply, no, it doesn't. Another question to ponder on is the fact that, you know, if you're asked, is the truth even if no one believes it? Well, sure it is. The truth is always going to be the truth. You can't compromise the truth. And is a lie even if everyone believes it? Well, sure it is. A lie is always going to be a lie, even if everyone believes that lie. It's always going to be a lie. So in asking that, bear with me as I get a drink of water, 1 second. So in asking that, alhamdulillah, for the water. So in asking that, ask yourself, do you believe in Santa? Do you believe in Santa Claus right now? If we're adults, most likely you don't believe in Santa Claus right now, but at some point you did. But ask yourself, at some point along the way, have you ever tried to persuade or make children believe that Santa Claus exists? While knowing that he doesn't exist, have you tried to influence children to believe that he exists? Sure you have. We've all done that at some point in our lives. And so ask ourselves, is God one? We'd say yes. Even the Christians that follow the Trinity, they're going to say, yes, God is one. And we'll leave it at that. Is God one? Yes, he's one. Okay, so are there 3 gods? The answer from the Christians would be, no, there's not 3 gods. But is God a Trinity? Well, some would say yes. And as we've seen during this conversation, and with the religious theologians from the past that I mentioned, Marcion and Seneca and the Stoics and on down, they were debating this very issue. Is God a Trinity? Some would say yes, and some would say no. Some Christians today would say yes. As Chris mentioned, there's Unitarians that are obviously going to say no. Matter of fact, there's a diehard Trinitarian preacher by the name of Stephen Anderson, and you can look up his videos on YouTube, and you'll see that he's so adamant about the Trinity that he's had people physically removed from his church. He was furious on stage while he's having these people manhandled and physically removed from his church because they didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. And if you take a man like this and you place him in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity, he's the type of person that would have had people taken to the slaughter. He would have had people burned at the stake. He would have had them excommunicated and tortured because they didn't believe in the Trinity. Okay, so that's just a simple fact. You can study the history and the development of Christianity, and you'll see that these people had very, very, you know, you're gonna believe what they wanted you to believe, and that's it. And if you didn't believe what they wanted you to believe, you were going to be murdered, you're going to be tortured and excommunicated or whatever. They're going to get rid of you. So that's, you can look into that, alhamdulillah. But the Stephen Anderson is a prime example of that. So as we proceed with the questions, we have to say, okay, well, let's think about this. If God is one, did Abraham and Moses, did they worship God? Well, yes, they did. Did they worship Jesus? No, Abraham and Moses, peace and blessing be upon them both, they did not worship Jesus. Did God worship Jesus? Did God himself worship Jesus? Absolutely not. But did Jesus worship God? Absolutely, he did. So ask ourselves, as children, if we were 5-year-old children, did we understand that God is one? Would we understand that concept? Absolutely. Would we understand the concept of the Trinity? No, we would not. Most grown people with doctorate, with high education, they simply don't understand what the Trinity is. And that's, you have to be honest with yourself. Most people don't understand it. They try to make themselves and convince themselves that they understand it, but inevitably they don't truly understand it. It's incomprehensible. We can't understand it. Christians struggle trying to explain it. So we have to ask ourselves, does God change? Well, no, he doesn't change. But did Jesus grow from an embryo to a 33-year-old prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, in Jerusalem, and did he grow? Did he? Absolutely. So does God eat? No, he didn't. But did Jesus eat broiled fish and honeycomb and sit with the disciples at the Last Supper, and did he eat? Well, absolutely he did. So, in saying this, I want to read a brief story, and please bear with me. We're going to talk about some things here today. So in this story, very interesting story, I'm going to start right now on one remarkable life, alhamdulillah. So it says, before he was born, his mother had a visitor from heaven who told her that her son would not be a mere mortal, but in fact would be divine. His birth was accompanied by unusual divine signs in the heavens. As an adult, he left his home to engage on an itinerant preaching ministry. He went from village to town, telling all who would listen that they should not be concerned about their earthly lives and their material goods. They should live for their spiritual life and eternal life. He gathered a number of followers around him, and who became convinced that he was no ordinary man, but he was the Son of God. He did miracles to confirm them in their beliefs, and he could heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead. At the end of his life, he aroused opposition among the ruling authorities of Rome and was put on trial, but they could not kill his soul. He ascended to heaven and continues to live there to this day. To prove that he lived on after leaving this earth, he appeared again to at least one of his doubting followers, who became convinced. In fact, he remains with us now. It says later, some of his followers wrote books about him, and we can still read about him today. But very few of you have ever seen these books. And I can imagine most of you do not even know who this great miracle-working Son of God was. I've been referring to a man named Apollonius, who came from the town of Tyana. He was a pagan that's a polytheistic worshiper of many Roman gods, and a renowned philosopher of his day. His followers thought he was immortal, and we have a book written about him by his later devotee, Philostratus. So in this story, I bring this up because this is just one of many so-called man god that have existed in the world. There's been many, and so this is nothing new. Matter of fact, the God men such as Alexander the Great, Baal Shem Tov, Octavian, Caesar Augustus, Buddha, Adonis, Isis, Attis of Phrygia, Dionysus, Osiris, Mithras, Ptolemy Soter, Serapis Christus, and and the list goes on. And so what we see here is we see that Christianity, and no offense to anyone, but the reality is that Christianity was founded on Greco-Roman beliefs, and the Greco-Roman beliefs consisted of a multitude of gods and a multitude of men god whose stories paralleled that of Jesus, peace and blessing be upon him. And that's just a simple reality. So if we're gonna talk about this, we have to truly be honest with ourselves. And once again, the original question that I posed are we looking for truth, or are we just looking to be comfortable? We're trying to stick to our the golden calf, that the golden calf syndrome that makes us comfortable and makes us feel at ease. And the reality is the truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes we have to ponder and reflect. Just as if you read Bart Ehrman's book, I just happen to have it here, so I used one of his quote from the book. But if you study the writings of Bart Ehrman, as well as other people, such as myself for that matter. I am the author of the book, Consider Islam Disproving the Pages of Propaganda, alhamdulillah. And I talk about what were my contentions with Christianity originally. And wondering, sitting in the church wondering, who are we praying to right now? And be honest with yourselves. You've had to ask that question at some point. And what's the hierarchy here? And this is something that's been, contentions that have existed once again in Christianity from day one. And so we can try to sweep this stuff under the rug and pretend that it doesn't exist, but it does exist. And Muslims didn't put it there. So I'm not trying to be rude or be abrasive in any way. I'm just trying to get us to think logically and not engage in what psychologists refer to as cognitive bias. Cognitive dissonance, where we believe two contrasting things at the same time. We believe that God is one, but we believe that he's also three somehow. And we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and Jesus is God as well. That's cognitive dissonance. Those are two contrasting beliefs that someone from the psychologists refer to as people that are making themselves believe two contradicting things. And so we can proceed. That's pretty much all I wanted to say with my opening on this topic, and we can certainly discuss the scriptures and proceed from there, inshallah. So thank you for your time.